Hello there, I'm Toby Haydoke, and destroy the gods, and we destroy ourselves. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about the way love can bond people from different times and places, but so too can hate. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your John Crockett's from your Mars-Venus rockets, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, one of the regulars is still missing from the studio, but she still earns her place in the episode title. So join me, Toby Haydoke, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Bride of Sacrifice, or I Should Coco Kameka. First broadcast on the 6th of June 1964 at 5:15 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman. It was written by John Lucarotti, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Crockett. It was watched by 7.9 million people, and the audience appreciation was 57. Barbara stops Ixter from killing Ian by holding a knife to Totoxel's throat. The High Priest of Sacrifice is now even more convinced that Barbara is not really Yetaxa, and so he turns his attention to Susan. With the assistance of another priest, Tonila, he arranges for Susan to meet the perfect victim, whose every wish must be granted. The victim decides to marry Susan, and when she rejects him, as Totoxel had anticipated, Aztec law demands that she be punished severely. Meanwhile, the Doctor has brewed cocoa for Kameka, in the process becoming inadvertently betrothed. But he has also discovered a stone behind which is hidden a tunnel that runs below Yetaxa's tomb. He and Ian plan to investigate by the dark of night, but Ixter sees an opportunity to take his final revenge. The When. 9th of March 1964. While John Lucarotti is busy writing The Aztecs, discussion is underway regarding Doctor Who's time slot. In particular, Terence Cook, the organiser for BBC Drama Serials Department, indicates that the programme will be brought forward by 15 minutes to a 5 p.m. start time. This change will take place as of 6th of June, the broadcast date for The Aztecs, Episode 3. But just 10 days later, on the 19th of March, Cook informs the production team that Doctor Who will stay at 5:15 p.m. after all. 13th of April 1964. With Carol Ann Ford scheduled to be on holiday during the studio sessions for The Warriors of Death and The Bride of Sacrifice, the two middle instalments of The Aztecs, arrangements have been made to release her from rehearsals for the 5th episode of the preceding story, The Keys of Marinus, so that she can pre-film material at Ealing on this day. Joining Ford in a scene for The Bride of Sacrifice are not only Keith Pyatt as Ortlock and Walter Randall as Tonila, who had also been required for the pre-recorded segment to be inserted into The Warriors of Death, but also André Boulet as the perfect victim. 14th of April 1964. One additional insert for The Bride of Sacrifice is pre-filmed at Ealing. This is the shot of water rushing over Ian's feet for the episode's closing moments, though a stand-in is used to save having to pull William Russell out of rehearsals for The Keys of Marinus. 11th of May 1964. Rehearsals begin for The Bride of Sacrifice at the Uxbridge Road Drill Hall. Carol Ann Ford is now enjoying the second half of her fortnight's holiday, so she isn't present for the week. 15th of May 1964. For the second week in a row, Doctor Who is recorded in Studio 3 at BBC Television Centre. But you shouldn't take it for granted that the perennial battle over the show's studio space has been settled at last. For more on that, come back for the too much information on episode 4 of The Aztecs, The Day of Darkness. During a break from camera rehearsals this afternoon, publicity photographs are taken of William Hartnell as the Doctor and Margot van der Berg as Kameka. They are staged on the set for the Garden of Peace, which designer Barry Newbury has now reassembled. It was mistakenly broken up after the taping of Part 1, The Temple of Evil, on the 1st of May, and was hastily replaced with a temporary solution for The Warriors of Death on the 8th of May. The Bride of Sacrifice is recorded as usual between 8:30 and 9:45 p.m. Unfortunately, at the end of the evening, it's discovered that there's an issue with the closing credits. Bear in mind that in 1964, the closing credits were a physical entity, printed to the production team's specification and hung on a roller at which one of the studio cameras was pointing. In this case, however, it's found that the captions have been printed erratically. There's nothing to be done about this at literally the very last minute, so the day ends with the Bride of Sacrifice ever so slightly incomplete. 22nd of May 1964. Doctor Who is back at its original Lime Grove production home in Studio D to record The Day of Darkness. But it's now also been agreed that there'll be an additional half an hour of studio time to allow director John Crockett to tape the closing credits for The Bride of Sacrifice. Yes, you heard me. 30 whole minutes for the bit of the show that you probably just fast-forward through, right? Well, no, not you, probably. If you listen to too much information, chances are you're one of those noble souls who refuses to peel their eyes from the screen until the copyright notice has faded to black. But you know what I mean. And, in fact, it's not just studio time that's needed to rectify this particular problem. A second roller caption machine has had to be booked to save the crew from having to set up the credits for The Bride of Sacrifice, dismantle them, and then hang the credits for The Day of Darkness. Nobody said making television in the 1960s was easy. 6th of June 1964. The Bride of Sacrifice does indeed air at 5:15 p.m, precisely on schedule. It gains an extra 500,000 viewers as compared to the first 2 episodes of The Aztecs, racking up an audience of 7.9 million. That helps Doctor Who to achieve its highest chart placement to date, coming in at number 19 in the weekly table, one better than The Snows of Terror, the 4th part of The Keys of Marinus. But that comes at the expense of the appreciation figure, which dives 5% to 57%, the lowest mark since The Firemaker, the last instalment of the very first story, way back in those pre-Dalek days of mid-December 1963. 12th of June 1964. The Aztecs is the subject of a rather derisory allusion in today's edition of the Buckinghamshire Examiner. The item in question is actually a brief assessment of the Yul Brynner film Kings of the Sun. But the inclusion of the movie of the legendary Mayon of Mexico leads the paper to deem that, although not unlike the childish BBC TV series Doctor Who, it might prove entertaining to some of the less educated cinegoers. Ooh la la. The what? The Bride of Sacrifice opens with a restaging of the final seconds of The Warriors of Death. The 2 versions of these events differ in several small ways. The characters aren't all in quite the same positions, for instance, and Barbara can now be seen entering the barracks behind Tlatoxel. But the biggest difference is that, with this sequence no longer serving as a cliffhanger, John Crockett has dispensed with the extended moment of hesitation that Barbara experiences after Tlatoxel taunts her about saving Ian. Instead, her decision to threaten the High Priest of Sacrifice comes almost instantaneously. There are subtle differences in the ensuing action between script and screen. Once Barbara declares that she will kill Tlatoxel if Ian dies, John Lucarotti writes, "Barbara tightens her grip. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that she means it. Tlatoxel knows it. Slowly he shakes his head at Ixter. Ixter lowers his club." This comes before Barbara's directive to put the weapon down, whereas on recording, Ixter doesn't move until Barbara's instruction. Similarly, the scripted scene has Barbara take the knife away from Tlatoxel's throat as soon as Ixter has cast his club aside. In the broadcast version, however, she waits until Tlatoxel has agreed not to punish her companions. Andre Boulay, who's portraying the perfect victim, appears to make a mistake following his announcement that Ixter cannot claim victory in the combat. After banging the ceremonial clubs together, he starts to put them back down on the table next to Ian, but then he seems to remember that he's actually supposed to hand them to Walter Randall, who's playing Tonila, which is what's called for in the script. Indeed, it looks like he's prompted by Randall gesturing for Boulay to give the clubs to him. As a result, the transfer looks a little awkward on screen. Stage directions have the two guards go to Ian's side as soon as Ortlock instructs them to do so, but on screen they wait until Tlatoxel and Ixter start to move away from the table. It would seem that John Crockett chooses to stagger the action like this so that viewers aren't distracted from Tlatoxel picking up the poisonous thorn. The following scene of Barbara and Ortlock in the temple was not scripted to feature any other characters. The inclusion of the Aztec guards and their captain is a late addition to the camera script. The sequence ends with a poignant stage direction. Having been beseeched by Ortlock not to prove false, Barbara turns away from him. His words have cut into her. When we move over to the Doctor and Tlatoxel in the Garden of Peace, the script says that Doctor Who is sitting dejectedly in the courtyard. He has a posy of flowers in his hands. One by one, he plucks out the petals. William Hartnell's performance, however, tends more towards disgruntlement than petulance, and he's just examining the flowers, not actively destroying them. The skill and timing of the camera operators is on full display at the start of the scene, where Ian awakens in the barracks. The initial close-up of the schoolteacher is on camera 1. We then switch to camera 4, which is providing a close-up of Ixter. Very out of focus and from a low angle. Very focus, as if waking up. Camera 4 then has to scoot out of the way once the shot goes back to Ian, so that it isn't visible when camera 1 pulls back out to a two-shot of Ian and Ixter, a feat the operator has only 6 seconds to accomplish. The problem of actors delivering paraphrased versions of their lines rears its head in this scene. Here, Ixter reminds Ian, "Did you yourself not say, 'Use stealth, surprise your enemy'?" Except what he's describing is a version of Ian's dialogue that appears in the script for The Warriors of Death, but is not quite what William Russell actually delivered, as we discussed last time. Indeed, despite Ixter invoking the word stealth on 2 occasions here, it's never uttered on screen by Ian at any point in the Aztecs. As written, Ixter is a right barrel of laughs here. First, after pointing out that he followed Ian's own advice to defeat him, the accompanying stage direction is, he laughs. He is pleased with his moral victory. More laughs are meant to come as Ixter reacts to Ian's surprise when the warrior offers to help him to his feet, and again when Ixter explains that his deception about the drawings of the tomb was another example of stealth and cunning. Ian Cullen, playing Ixter, ignores all of these. The only surviving scripted laugh occurs when he tells Tlatoxel that no drawings exist, and even then, Cullen settles for a brief chuckle. The effect is to make Ixter less cartoonish than he appears on the printed page, and correspondingly, more menacing. For a script as well written as The Aztecs, the fate of Ixter's father represents a rather surprising loose end. It's already been established as far back as episode 1 that he is dead, and this is reiterated by Ixter here. But, one speech later, Ixter instead states that his father has disappeared. Later we'll learn that his father gave Kameka a brooch which came from Yetaxa's tomb, so it seems pretty clear that Ixter's father is meant to have taken advantage of the tunnel that leads from the Garden of Peace under the tomb to rob it of its riches, and that he had already begun this process before his death. It also seems reasonable to presume that he perished while in the act of plundering, perhaps even drowned under circumstances very similar to those Ian faces at the end of The Bride of Sacrifice. But in that case, it's odd that there's no on-screen confirmation of this. John Lucarotti seems to be building up to the discovery of Ixter's father's body while Ian explores the tunnel, but it never comes to pass. When Tlatoxel is trying to persuade Tonila to help him poison Barbara to assess her divinity, a stage direction explains that Tonila is impressed by this logic, whereupon Tlatoxel drives home to success. After discussing Coco with Ortlock in the temple garden, Kameka approaches the Doctor, who has been examining the engraved stone. The staging of their exchange isn't quite in line with the script, which indicates that the stone should be situated between them. The symbol of Yetaxa carved upon it is described in the script as a coiled serpent, although designer Barry Newbury seems to have devised something more amorphous in shape. Before their conquest by the Europeans, the peoples who lived in the near modern-day Mexico really did use cocoa beans as a form of currency, as Kameka and the Doctor discuss here. As a result, cocoa and chocolate featured prominently in Aztec society. The notion that brewing cocoa might constitute a proposal of marriage comes from the belief that the Aztecs drank cocoa as an aphrodisiac. This was probably inspired by a contemporary account of a banquet held by Moctezuma, the last Aztec emperor. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of Cortez's conquistadors, described Moctezuma as drinking nothing but a frothy beverage made from chocolate, which women served to him in a golden pitcher. There is a significant change in the action which accompanies Tlatoxel and Tonila's attempt to poison Barbara. As written, after Barbara agrees to share a drink in the name of reconciliation, Ian watches closely. Tlatoxel has turned to Tonila and empties poison in the bowl. Ian sees the poison put in the bowl. On screen, the implication is that the draft has already been poisoned, which would seem much more prudent given that the scripted version runs the risk of the assassination failing simply by virtue of Barbara having a keen eye and spotting what Tlatoxel is trying to do. The shot of the cup shattering is a cutaway to camera 5, a rare instance of Doctor Who being permitted to use that many cameras. Unless Jacqueline Hill is possessed of remarkable aim, of course, the cup that breaks isn't the same prop that she makes a motion to throw in the preceding shot on camera 1. John Lucarotti suggests that the poisoned liquid should be bubbling on the floor, but that doesn't happen on screen. When Tonila runs off, we see Tlatoxel slump against the sacrificial stone. As written, however, he falls on the floor, full of fear at being found out. He raises one arm across his face to ward off danger. Barbara is white with rage. When Barbara threatens to destroy him, Tlatoxel, defeated for the time being, gets up and goes out with such dignity as he has left. Ian is meant to reappear as soon as Tlatoxel leaves, but John Crockett lets camera 1 linger for a few seconds on Barbara, alone in her misery. When Kameka reveals to the Doctor that he has proposed marriage by brewing cocoa for her, a stage direction indicates that Doctor Who looks absolutely shaken. In his production text for the DVD special edition of The Aztecs, Matthew Kilburn points out that the Doctor's actions here mirror the demeanour of Oscar Zoroaster Fadrig Isaac Norman Henkel Emmanuel Ambrose Diggs, otherwise known as L. Frank Baum's eponymous The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, whose portrayal by Frank Morgan in the 1939 classic movie adaptation The Wizard of Oz was an early inspiration for the Doctor's character. Like the wizard, the Doctor has greatly exaggerated the extent of his knowledge, of Aztec customs in this case, and is now suffering unforeseen consequences as a result. While discussing Susan, Tonila's surprise at her exceptional intelligence seems to intentionally recall An Unearthly Child, where Susan's advanced knowledge, and her sometimes perplexing lack of it, was what originally piqued Ian and Barbara's curiosity. Tonila recaps the scene of Susan in the seminary from The Warriors of Death. He identifies these events as having happened one day in the presence of Ortlock and myself, implying that some time has passed in the interim. This suggests that, while it's easy to assume that the Aztecs takes place within a fairly short time span, the TARDIS crew actually spends many days and possibly even weeks in Mexico. And we'll see more evidence for this next episode too. This helps to explain Kameka's infatuation with the Doctor. It's not a sudden crush that overwhelms her, but an attraction that develops over an extended period of time. At the start of the scene in the seminary, a stage direction indicates that Ortlock should have a book in hand, although Keith Pyatt holds no such prop on screen. Presumably, this book was meant to be the Annals of Quantitlan, from which Ortlock quizzes Susan about the myth of the 5 suns in the sky. This is a real text, although the title was ascribed to it, in reference to the Mexican city of Cuantitlan, by French scholars, so Ortlok's use of it is anachronistic. It forms one of the 3 parts of the Codex Chimalpopoca, which is believed to have disappeared in the middle of the 20th century, although copies and photographs of its pages survive. Here, at Too Much Information, we strongly suspect that the Codex is sitting in a dusty vault somewhere, nestled between Mission to the Unknown and Episode 4 of the 10th Planet. The legend of the 5 suns refers to the Aztec belief that the world has been created on 5 occasions. Each of the first 4 attempts were deemed failures and were ultimately destroyed. On each occasion, a different god assumed the role of the sun, and the names cited by Susan refer to the domain traditionally associated with the corresponding god. For instance, the 3rd sun is the sun of fire and rain, because it was Tlaloc, the rain god, who became enraged and destroyed the world in a firestorm. Her reference to the current sun as the son of man represents some poetic license on John Lucarotti's part, however, since different versions of humanity were said to be present under each of the 5 suns. We might suppose that it's at least partly intended to evoke Jesus, known as the Son, S-O-N, of man, to reassure any members of the viewing Christian majority who might be uncomfortable after 3 weeks of Doctor Who steeped in the traditions of a pagan religion. The very end of the telecine insert doesn't quite follow the script. There, Susan bursts into tears and covers her face with her hands, and a dubbing note calls for sounds of crying. Instead, Carole Ann Ford delivers a more resolute performance, maintaining Susan's dignity rather than having her reduced to hysterics. The next scene dispenses with John Lucarotti's intended ending too. Having delivered his final line about setting up a garden with Kameka, the Doctor is meant to be looking around the garden, while between the pair we can see the stone that bears Yetax's symbol. The Doctor spies it, and camera 2 is supposed to push in fast to stone, as Kameka looks puzzled. None of this action happens, and the position of the camera is instead at an angle to the stone, leaving it well out of shot. Walter Randall's stoic performance as Tonila disguises some of the emotional torture that John Lucarotti intends for the character. When Barbara accuses him of sinning against her with the poison, a stage direction notes that Tonila is half convinced by all this and is in some agony of indecision. Tlatoxel stays out of frame during this part of the scene, but that doesn't seem to have been Lucarotti's vision. Tlatoxel, ever wary, steps in smartly, he writes when Barbara remonstrates with Tonila, and when Barbara admonishes him to be quiet, Tlatoxel is furious, but restrains himself. Another stage direction that didn't survive rehearsals describes Barbara's demeanour after Tlatoxel demands a punishment with thorns for the as-yet unnamed offender who will, of course, turn out to be Susan. Writes John Lucarotti, Barbara turns her head away. She is horrified. She half whispers. Likewise, Barbara's agreement to the punishment is meant to come after a pause. A moment, Barbara nods sharply, reluctantly. Tlatoxel smiles in triumph. Suddenly, Barbara gets an idea. Only now does she suggest that her servant should be present. Lucarotti then writes that Tlatoxel holds on to Tonila's arm to stop him saying anything. After the High Priest of Sacrifice consents to her suggestion, Barbara looks at Tlatoxel, sensing something, but not even guessing. The arrangement of the barracks at night doesn't quite accord with the script. It describes Ian sleeping on a bed, whereas the televised version has him and Ixta lying on rugs instead. When Ian arrives in the garden to meet the Doctor, there's a curious camera direction. It indicates that camera 2 should move past Ixta in the left foreground to find the Doctor, and then crab left into a 2-shot with Ian and the Doctor. There's no further reference to Ixta until after Ian enters the tunnel, so it's not clear if John Crockett wanted to establish Ixta's lurking presence this early in the scene, or if he mistakenly referred to Ixta in the camera direction when he actually meant Ian. Barry Newbury's design of the temple wall places the stone with Yetax's symbol in an elevated position, so that Ian has to climb up onto a bench to shift it. That doesn't seem to have been John Lucarotti's idea, however, since Ian crouches down in the corresponding stage direction. The gradual way that Ian tugs at the stone from the wall is another discrepancy between script and screen. As written, having confirmed to the Doctor that the stone can be moved, Ian works away at the stone. Suddenly, it comes clear of the wall. The carved serpents on full display during this sequence aren't taken from stock. They were specially created for the Aztecs by Mrs. Constance Oldham of Primrose Hill, and were carved from jablite at a cost of £10 each. Ian leaves the stone resting atop one of the carved serpents. That doesn't seem to have been John Lucarotti's intention, however, because a later stage direction describes it lying on the ground. The quick cut to the watching Ixter after Ian starts to enter the tunnel is not in the camera script. It's been brought forward from a little later, where it leads directly to Ixter's encounter with the Doctor. Doctor Who is still on the guard. Suddenly we are aware of Ixter watching. Ixter smiles and walks into the garden. The short scene in the tunnel at this point is a little less brief in the script. The tunnel is small and cramped and damp. Ian moves slowly along it, checking sides and roof. Next to this stage direction is a single typewritten annotation. Stand, which suggests that John Crockett hadn't yet decided how much vertical clearance would be conveyed on screen. When Ixter replaces the stone, John Lucarotti writes that the Doctor knows he is defeated. William Hartnell certainly conveys this with an utterly dejected performance, flapping his hands and resolutely refusing to meet the other man's gaze. After the pre-filmed shot of Ian's feet getting wet, the script suggests additional telecine of water gushing into well, which John Lucarotti perhaps imagined to be represented by stock footage. In the event, however, John Crockett chooses to end the episode on a reaction shot of William Russell, with a lighting effect representing the flood. Because of the fault with the roller caption machine, a cut to a black screen follows before the next episode caption appears. The Who. Margot van der Burg, who plays Kameka in The Aztecs, was born Marguerite Victoria van der Burg in 1918 in Lewisham, Greater London, the daughter of South African Alphonse van der Burg and his wife Julia, née Gravina. So please ignore those sources who claim she was born in 1935 and that TV makeup in 1963 could perform pointless miracles. In the early 1930s, she did classes at the Royal Academy of Music, and she was a pupil at Trinity College of Music in Dover before enrolling at London's Central School of Speech and Drama in the late 1930s, although the institution had to spend some of her period here outside of London due to evacuation. Upon graduation in 1940, she joined the Pilgrim Players, performing as Mary Magdalene in the Passion Plays at Bodmin, and was praised for her remarkable clarity. She toured with the Players in a number of religiously based presentations, winning good notices as she did so. She was well established on radio early in her career. As Marguerite van der Burg, she played a nightingale in The Marriage of St. Francis in the BBC's Home Service, with music from the Dalek Invasion of Earth's Francis Chagrin in 1945, and by 1950 had broadcast from every department of BBC Radio before settling in on the Overseas programme, for which she also served as standby announcer. She was with the Thames Valley Theatre Company before moving to Salisbury Rep in 1949, where she had great success in the title role of the Heiress and as Celia in The Cocktail Party. And she also played Cordelia in King Lear, Eliza Doolittle in Pygmalion, and Barbara Faber in The Astonished Heart. Whilst at Salisbury in June 1951, she married architect Colin Adamson in a quiet ceremony before completing her season with the company, with the couple based in Putney, Margot's theatrical travels notwithstanding. She was appearing in 2 bouquets when she got married, with her saying "I do" on stage at the same time as in real life, although of course the ceremony with her theatrical husband wasn't legally binding, although as it was with the actor James Cairncross, they remain linked by Doctor Who, as he guest stars in the show's very next historical adventure, playing Le Maître in The Reign of Terror, and later Beta in The Crotons. By this time, Margot had made her first screen appearances. She'd played on television as early as 1946 in The Thracian Horses, and she had a non-speaking, uncredited role in Laurence Olivier's film of Hamlet. This didn't lead to a glittering movie career, but television was serving her better, with good roles in productions throughout the 1940s and 50s, which meant that by the time of the Aztecs, she was a veteran of the medium. Her career continued in a similar vein for the next couple of decades. She played on television in the likes of R3, Maigret and Edward VII in respectable guest roles, before returning to Doctor Who as Katura in The Keeper of Traken. She did a couple of classics, Sense and Sensibility in the Pickwick Papers, plus an episode of Dempsey and Makepeace before the end of her television career in the mid-1980s, and surfaced just once more at the cinema in the 1991 film Blonde Fist, starring Margie Clark. Her steady theatre career, which included doing poetry readings and recitals, sometimes alongside K9 himself, John Leeson, also wound down in the mid-1980s. Margot van der Berg died in July 2008 at the age of 90. André Boulet. For many years, André Boulet, who plays the perfect victim in The Aztecs, was, like Tom Booth and David Anderson, one of those Doctor Who actors that got away. But due to some intrepid work from various Who scholars and record diggers, we now have an accurate, if scant, account of his life and metamorphosing moniker. He was born Joseph Jean-Henri André Boulet, but Boulet spelled B-O-U-L-A-I-S, on the 16th of September 1934 to Frédéric Boulet and Yvonne Pontebriand. Now, if you'd care to dig, then you'll find alternative records giving his birth date as the 17th of December and or in 1932 or 1933, but there's been a fair amount of digging going on round these ear parts, and satisfaction has been reached. He was definitely, it seems, baptised on the 21st of September 1934 at the Saint-Jacques Roman Catholic Cathedral in Montreal. When he was 17, he and a friend decided to hitchhike from Montreal to New York, and once there, a chance encounter changed his life.
One night at the Blue Angel Bar, I noticed a gentleman who fascinated me. He kept pacing backward and forward, his glass in his hand, and his eyes fixed on me. I didn't know what to think. Finally, the strange gentleman approached me and introduced himself as a Hollywood talent scout. He told me he wanted me to go to Hollywood for a screen test.
The scout had to phone Boulet's parents to get their permission to take him to LA, and upon their agreement, he was in the big city and under the bright lights, albeit playing minor parts in a few movies, and he was definitely resident and working in the US in 1952. He first visited the UK in 1957, but having been ordered by his doctor to take a year off, he returned to Canada and then played at various New England theatres before touring Europe and settling in Paris in 1958. He established himself as an actor there, including appearances in the Reynaud Barreau Theatre Company and understudying in Peter Brook's production of Jean Genet's Le Balcon. He was supposed to have a role in that, but it got lost when the script was revised and the part removed. In 1963, his Fiat car, which he had left in Montreal, was auctioned off to cover money owed, $327, to the mechanics it had been left in the charge of. His 1964 employment in Doctor Who was a positive development for Boulet, who, less than 2 years earlier, had proved to be every inch the starving actor when he was caught and charged with stealing a packet of pork chops, a packet of cod fillets, a packet of cheese slices, and a tin of stuffed cabbage, for which he was fined £1 and ordered to pay £9 9 costs in May 1962. Ironically, later that year, he was in the dock again, but this time playing an aristocratic French playboy accused of jewellery theft in The Verdict Is Yours, a fictional scenario on ITV. Soon after his appearance as the perfect victim, however, he appears to have set sail for the States again, resident there by 1965 and in 1969, married to Pearl Yamponsky in Arlington, Virginia. One thing we know for sure about André is that he could sing, and by December 1969 he was performing on Broadway in the very first performance of the Alan J. Lerner André Previn musical Coco at the Mark Hellinger Theatre. Coco is set in Paris, so maybe his French connections had something to do with his suitability for the role of Julien Lesage. Not a huge part, but a named one in an illustrious company that included Katharine Hepburn in the lead role, as well as future security chief of Deep Space Nine, René Auberjonois. He would settle in America now, Andre, and continue to work as an actor, but at some point while crossing the Atlantic, keep up now because it's not easy to follow this fellow, he decided that he would now work under the name of Paul Dumont. He was established enough in the US by 1970 to be playing parts on television, notably a short run in the perennial daytime soap All My Children in 1970. In 1972, he appeared in the film Made for Each Other, written by and starring husband and wife team Joseph Bologna and Renee Taylor, and in 1975 he scores handsomely as the love interest, according to the Staten Island Advance, in the musical Irene at the Paper Mill Playhouse, and later worked at the Jean Frankel Theatre, which suggests that New York was the regular hangout for this handsome actor who could hold a tune. 1976 found him on the cusp of a long-term engagement in another daytime soap, Search for Tomorrow, but his character, Chris Delon, was written out after 7 months.
I suspected when I was first cast in the part that it was a test of chemistry between actors and characters, he reflected philosophically. The test just didn't work.
André Boulet, aka Paul Dumont, died on the 22nd of March 1996 in Los Angeles. And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. It's often said that Part 3 is where 4-episode Doctor Who stories struggle the most, sometimes just marking time between the escalation of the conflict seen in Part 2 and the ultimate resolution in the final instalment. But perhaps by virtue of having already navigated the narrative demands of the 7-part Marco Polo, John Lucarotti is ready for the challenge. And the way he keeps the Aztecs from flagging is by cleverly shifting his focus from the regular characters to the supporting cast. The time travellers are still front and centre in The Bride of Sacrifice, make no mistake. Barbara fends off another challenge to her legitimacy from Tlatoxel and Tanila. Susan's modern feminism offends the perfect victim. The Doctor stumbles into an engagement to be married, and Ian rounds off the episode in mortal peril. But each of these situations are brought about thanks to the spotlight Lucarotti shines on the Aztec characters. Tlatoxel continues his arch-scheming ways, and now he draws not only Ixta but also Tonila into his orbit. Having seeped into the story almost out of the background in The Warriors of Death, yoked to either Ortlock or to the perfect victim, Tonila is a much greater presence in this episode. Despite his status amongst the priesthood, he is now positioned as the Aztec on the street, as it were, giving the perspective of the average person who's merely bearing witness to the divine intrigues at play between Yetaxa, Tlatoxel, and Ortlock. Neither as convinced of Barbara's godhood as the High Priest of Knowledge, nor as certain of her duplicity as the High Priest of Sacrifice, Tonila serves as an effective foil. You could imagine the entire episode being told from his point of view, in which it would be the tale of a regular man, his faith put to the test, desperately striving to find a clever way to determine if the strange woman who's come into his people's midst is really a god or a dangerous charlatan. The perfect victim, too, comes into clearer focus in The Bride of Sacrifice. It's important to view him not through a 21st century lens and the knowledge that his imminent demise is a pointless act of meaningless ritual, but on his own terms. From his perspective, he's preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice to save his people from perpetual darkness, and his reward is to enjoy a few days in which his every whim is satisfied. So when Susan not only rejects him, but also describes him as mad and barbaric, it's hard not to feel a twang of sympathy towards the perfect victim, in spite of the fact that Susan's right to self-determination is also inarguably correct. The effect is to enhance Tlatoxel's villainy, since he's the one who set the two unsuspecting characters on such an appalling collision course. And then there's Ortlock, whose unique and vital role in the story now starts to become clear. Keith Pyatt's performance is nowhere near as showy as John Ringham's Tlatoxel, but it's all the more remarkable for the nuance he brings. Pyatt does a great job of evoking the inner struggles that Ortlock experiences as Barbara toys with his beliefs and loyalties, not just concerning human sacrifice, but even relatively mundane matters like Susan's punishment, while also bringing some levity to the part, such as his playful encouragement of Kameka's interest in the Doctor. Even Ian recognises the importance of the High Priest of Knowledge, telling Barbara that Ortlock's the extraordinary man here, thereby setting us up for the story's denouement in episode 4. But Lucarotti's decision to have Susan direct her accusation that the Aztecs are monsters to the most benign character on show is a clear indication that the writer is hugely interested in moral grey areas. And indeed, seeing as we tend to think of these early serials as alternating between sci-fi and aliens and historicals and human villains, the word monster seems like an uncanny reminder of what the show is all about. For Susan, the Aztec civilization is as monstrous as any formed by mutated Scaurosians or rubber Vord. Not all monsters are extraterrestrial. But we must also ask ourselves how judgmental she is being of a kindly man, Ortlock, who is bound by the norms of his civilization. There is, after all, a rationale behind all of their seemingly barbaric acts, and one that is based in a deep and profound belief. And, of course, our heroes are more than prepared to manipulate this comparatively simple people, who they hold an advantage over only because of their knowledge of the future, not because they're inherently more clever or more able, in order to suit their own ends, which in itself could be seen as pretty monstrous behaviour, depending on your perspective, of course. Oh, and, for once, the High Priest of Knowledge shall be in ignorance. Doctor Who, The Bride of Sacrifice, featured Keith Pyatt as Ortlock, John Ringham as Tretoxel, Ian Cullen as Ixter, Margot van der Burr as Kameka, Walter Randall as Tonila, Andre Boulay as the Perfect Victim, and David Anderson as the Aztec Captain. The title music was by Ron Grainer and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Richard Rodney Bennett. The conductor, Marcus Dodds. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer, Barry Newbury. And the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, it's the final instalment of the Aztecs, but has John Lucarotti devised a scenario which dooms the TARDIS travellers to failure? That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Day of Darkness, or Total Eclipse, then I'll cut out your heart. Too Much Information, The Bride of Sacrifice, was presented by me, Toby Haydoke, from a script I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone, with thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, Graham Kibble-White, Crowell Thal, and Ben Jolly. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, far too much information that is for now exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also nearly 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast, so if you want to hear Doctors producer Simon Curtis on Colony in Space, or Agatha Christie expert Mark Aldridge on The Ark, then head over to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information if it weren't for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that has been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those intrepid high priests of knowledge who were responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of the Aztecs, written by Matthew Kilburn, are a treasure trove of insight and information. Newly available from Telos Publishing is the Doctor Who Production Diary Volume 1 The Hartnell Years by David Brunt. The deepest dive ever undertaken into the surviving documentation that depicts the making of Doctor Who, this goldmine of day-to-day details will let you feel as though you're sitting in the office in 1964, peering over the shoulders of Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. The Doctor Who Production Diary is the latest addition to a small library of splendid reference works that chronicle the earliest days of Doctor Who. They span Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who The Early Years, the Titanic tag team of Doctor Who The 60s and Doctor Who The Handbook, The First Doctor, by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, to the indispensable Doctor Who The Complete History Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History, also edited by Mark Wright, boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson and Alistair McGowan, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for the Aztecs can be found in issue 266, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Alan Barnes studied the Aztecs in issue 516. And a discussion of the relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement to the premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 29 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Aztecs, though this one is more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. I walk in the shadows of giants so dedicated to their endeavours that they never think to take a fortnight's holiday, and besides, they're too big to fit into the film studios at Ealing anyway. I'm indebted to the patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Stephen Moffat, Peter Burns, James Curray-Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Tim Arding, Nigel Bromley, Paul Cook, Richard Chalk, Peter Chamberlain, Grant Davidson, John Deere, Chris Dunford-Kelk, Paul Dunn, El Pandras, Susie Ferguson, Jason Gorman, Siobhan Galichon, Paul Harris, Chris Hyam, Ian Key, Ashley Knight, Joe Llewellyn, Ian K. McLachlan, Philip Marsh, Nathan Martin, Roland Moore, Rick Moran, Kevin Murdoch, Graham Knott, Adam Parker, Barry Platt, Risto Matti Cirillo, Frank Shales, DW Fan 91, Simon King, Scott Burdett, Olivia Hayden, David Nichol, Garth Maker, Lee Coburn, William Lee, Ian Bradley, Damien McGee, Noel Reid Jr., William Remmers, Nigel Sharp, the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Tauran Woodbeasts, Richard Harris, Jasper Ferguson, John Davey, Paul Gibbons and Paul Sama. Please follow me on social media wherever I am, which is pretty much everywhere, at Haydoke Podcasts and at Toby Haydoke on Twitter. Also, I'm on Blue Sky. I'm at toby.haydoke on Instagram. I have a Facebook page. There is a YouTube channel. If you could like and subscribe to that, it really helps. And if you could give 5 stars and a couple of positive lines of review to these podcasts wherever you find them, Apple, Spotify, Podbean, wherever you get them, those 5 stars and a few lines of review really, really do help. But mostly, thanks very much for listening. But a reminder, yes, you can go to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke to become a patron, or you can support these in another way financially without having a monthly obligation at ko-fi.com/Toby Haydoke. Any support is, of course, hugely appreciated.